Hello, guys. Welcome back to the ThinkerNick podcast. I'm your host, Nick Daniels, and once again, joined by Nicola Tyler. How are we today?
Fine, thanks.
Excellent. Okay, so in today's episode, guys, we're going to jump into habits. We're going to talk all about habits today and the knowledge that I've acquired from habits and forming habits, good habits, bad habits, and how to understand them came from this book over here called The Power of Habit, which I highly recommend, by Charles Duhigg. And he basically goes into detail about why habits are formed, why we do what we do, and basically the model that he uses in the book is that there's a cue, a routine, and a reward for that habit. So the cue, for example, if we use coffee, okay, you're at work and you're tired, that would be the cue, is that you're tired. You then do the routine, which would be going and getting a cup of coffee and drinking it. And the reward would be, you feel energized, you've got more energy, your brain's stimulated, and you're ready to go. Now, another book that I read, which is probably the best book I've read to date, which is by Jim Quick. It is called Limitless. He touches on habits and basically why we do them and how it works. And he talks about when we start a habit, there needs to be a motivation. And that motivation is either for pleasure or pain, hope or fear, social acceptance or rejection. So a lot of people, for example, like when I was younger, I started smoking and I did it because of social acceptance, because I wanted to fit in. So that would have been my motivation for smoking. The second thing is the ability to do it. Do we have the capacity to, perform that habit? And these are generally related to having the time to do it, the money to do it, the physical effort to do it. And then obviously, like I spoke about the cue before, which would have been the prompt. That's basically, what triggers the habit. So I've definitely got quite a few. I feel like I've got a lot more good habits than bad habits now, but I've definitely had my fair share of bad habits. So Nicola, would you like to touch on habits? What are they? And how do we form habits?
Habits are repeated behaviors, in essence. It's just the things that we do over and over again. And like you said, sometimes good ones, sometimes bad ones. They're almost like a cognitive addiction. We're doing them without thinking. And when something becomes habitual, you often don't perceive it to be perhaps a skill. So a skill forms in a very similar kind of way. It's the repetition. So your brain develops a pattern, and that pattern, repeated over time, can become a skill. So if you can type, it's a skill. Habits seem to have more of an emotive attachment, where your motivation to type or to learn to type might initially be a habit, but over time it just becomes something that you do. So the big focus on habits these days, I think, is the awareness of behavior that is perhaps attached to well-being, a sense of achievement, accomplishment, goal setting, etc., and sort of living your best life. Yeah. So the books today seem to focus very much on habit, but I think it's something that we've been doing for years. And the challenge isn't necessarily the habit, it's breaking or changing a habit.
Yeah, which is exactly what we're going to. Yeah, exactly. We're going to get into that. So let's look at bad habits then, and looking at breaking a habit. And from what I've read in this book, you cannot forget a habit, basically, but you can replace a habit. So Nicola, let me start by asking you, do you have a bad habit? Have you ever tried to quit that habit, and what happened?
Yes, and not as easy as it sounds.
Okay, would you like to elaborate on that?
Habits are very much driven by environment. So if you read some of the books that you've read, you'll also learn that you can form habits in places. So you do certain things in certain places. You might do certain things at certain times. You might do certain things with certain people. So breaking a habit is not so much about, you don't necessarily break a habit. You can break a pattern in thinking. That's really what lateral thinking is all about. But when it comes to changing habits, of the research that I've done, you can either progressively visualize a different state, which is much more around Joe Dispenza breaking the habit of being yourself. He does a lot of work around meditation and laying down new neural pathways based on visualization. The books, I haven't actually read Limitless, but I have read The Power of Habit and Atomic Habits by James Clear. And what those two books allude to is really about not breaking a habit, but replacing a quote unquote bad habit with a more positive one. So it's attaching a new behavior to a new trigger. So if you go to your coffee example, someone I know that read Atomic Habits, a senior executive in a business, and I think has a lot of personal self-discipline anyway. But he said, one of my daily habits, if you like, is I get out of bed. So he said, when I get out of bed every morning, I'm going to plank up. He does get up. I don't know what his little routines are, but he planks first thing every morning because he has to get out of bed every morning. During lockdown, I did a similar thing where it was coffee. I'd come downstairs, I'd put my coffee on, my little machine in my kitchen, and it used to take about 5 minutes for it to percolate. So I got in the habit during lockdown, as while my coffee was on, I would plank. And to begin with, I was doing like 30 seconds, 40 seconds, but I actually got up to 4 minutes because the coffee still hadn't finished. I didn't quite make the whole time. 4 minutes was a struggle, but I did actually get up to 4 minutes of planking. So, wow. And that was attaching a behavior to a daily routine. Yeah, so bad habits are easy to identify because they're sort of finger pointing exercises. Break them is more about what do you replace them with.
Yeah, it's funny, just touching on what you were saying about environments and how the environment can affect your habit. Again, from this book, there was a study done on mice, and they basically put the mice in a cage with pretty much nothing else, no hamster wheel or no mouse wheel, no activities to do. And they filled up 2 waters. And I think one of the waters, it goes something along these lines. But one of the waters had vodka in it, which was a stimulant, and the other one had water. And what they found is that the mice in the cage kept on going to, obviously, the one with the stimulant in it. They then did another study where they put some more activities in the cage, like a hamster wheel and stuff, where, first of all, the mouse can be active, which has a number of benefits if we compare that to human beings when you're active, and a number of other activities. And they found that the mice actually neglected the vodka stimulant, basically, and just went straight for, the normal clean water. So that's very relevant to what you're saying with how environment has a big impact on habits. But now, Nicola, why do we willfully and consciously engage in self-destructive habits while ignoring our better judgment? And I mean, this happens all the time. So why do you think we always ignore our better judgment?
I mean, that's a good question, Nick. And I think when you mentioned Limitless, you spoke about social as a motivation. And I think sometimes habits are formed in groups, not in isolation. And they maintain themselves in isolation, but they're often formed in groups. So they didn't put a mouse in a cage to give them vodka. They put a group of mice in a cage to give them vodka. So I wonder what that experiment would have looked like if it had just been singular. So you can't create a habit of something you've never had an experience of. So if you've never eaten chocolate, why would you have the habit of eating a chocolate at 10 o'clock every morning, or with your coffee in an afternoon? So experience, and I think social environments play a massive role in how those habits are formed. I honestly think environment has a huge role to play. So some people, if you move house, your disciplines might change. If you change countries, change jobs, change the people that you hang out with, I think all of that has a big impact and an influence on how we behave. So I've always said misery likes company. So in the one book, I think it's actually the Charles Duhigg book, they talk about Alcoholics Anonymous.
Yeah.
And the 12 steps of the AA were actually written down basically on a serviette or the back of a cigarette packet type of thing. But they weren't crafted scientifically. They were researched scientifically after they were crafted. And one of the things they recognized is that when people were drinking alcohol, they were doing it mostly in community. So you mostly drank with your friends. So the AA maintains the relational need, the community need, but without alcohol. So you satiate the need for community, but you do it in an environment without alcohol. So I personally think that the people we surround ourselves with and the physical environment in which we find ourselves in has a massive impact on our behavior. And it's the repeated behaviors that we call a habit.
Yeah.
So who's your circle?
Yeah, I definitely choose the right one. A perfect example in my life currently would be, so obviously living in Vietnam for 5 years, I've stayed here, but people have come and gone, but predominantly my friendship circle has stayed the same. And then there's obviously been new additions. And a lot of my best friends have started cycling recently. And now I think I've been bitten by the cycling bug as well, because I absolutely love it after 2 cycles. But, that's something I would never, ever, ever have tried if my friends didn't, start cycling and become a part of it. So far, 2 Tuesdays in a row, I've got up at 4:30 every morning. Well, both those mornings to form a habit of cycling. So environment definitely does play a huge part in that. Now, Nicola, if you could offer, some advice to people who are wanting to change habits, maybe start afresh, what would it be?
So the first thing is, I think, forgive yourself. So when you have a bad habit, it's very easy to berate yourself, say, I'm not good enough, or I shouldn't be doing this, and almost like a self-ticking off. And I think the first thing to do is sort of forgive yourself. It's okay. And I've always said the gift of the past is that it's over. So if you've done that every day up until today, that's what you've done. Then you've almost got to have a vision of who do you want to become, or how do you want to be? Now, the temptation there is you want to be everything good. So you want to suddenly bring on board 25 great new habits and your whole life will be better. That's unlikely to happen. So pick 1, maybe 2, and incrementally add to those, and recognize that it takes time to change behavior. And the new habit won't just become a new habit because you've taken years to ingrain something. The new habit will take time before it's more dominant than the old habit. So that requires high levels of repetition. And one of the hardest things businesses find is repeated behaviors to form new cultures in organizations. So really an organizational culture is the combination of rituals and habits that they have, which are predominantly human behavior. So if you introduce a new habit, or when you introduce a new habit, recognize that it takes time. Now, some people say 3 times a day for 21 days. Some people are now saying, actually, it takes longer. When I worked with De Bono, I think he said 57 or 67 consecutive repeats. And Edward used to say, people think about repetition, but he said it's actually the word consecutive. Consecutive. So if you keep breaking the habit, you go back to 0. You've got to repeat something. And I think, I forget the actual number, but it was definitely like, let's say around 67. But you've got to repeat things consecutively. And if you introduce it, let's say planking. I mean, I did it for probably 3 months. And then I stopped planking. So I now don't have the habit of waking up in the morning and doing a 4-minute plank. If I'd continued, I would probably be a lot more stealth-like than I currently am. But new habits have to be continuous so that you become you embody the new behavior. Otherwise, you'll just go back to what you've always done. We're a bit like elastic bands. So we stretch ourselves, but when we stretch, if you take the pressure off, we go back to the same state. Yeah, so, if we go back to that resting state, we just become what we always were. So every now and again, you might have to break the elastic, which means almost like a seismic event in your brain to say, that's enough. I've absolutely had enough. And your desire for the change has to be greater than your attachment to the bad habit.
Yeah.
Motivation, environment, these are massive triggers.
Yeah. And we all know how hard it is to replace a bad habit. I mean, I stopped smoking, I think 3 years ago now. But it's really strange because what I did is it was a New Year's resolution. And I was like, okay, after tonight, big party, New Year's Eve, I'm going to stop smoking. And I just went cold turkey. And the first 2 nights that I went out, it was very, very hard to not smoke. And then I did a bit of reading on habits, and I was always a social smoker. I'd never smoke unless, I wouldn't smoke unless I was drinking. And after reading the book, it wasn't actually the cigarette I was craving. It was the habit of drinking with smoking that I needed to break. It wasn't the nicotine. So once you understand, the process of habits and how you can replace a habit, it becomes a lot easier to do. And just talking about what you were saying earlier, you almost made it seem like in order to replace a habit, you need to make it a way of life, at least for that initial period of time until the habit is replaced.
Definitely. I think another good thing, and I was speaking about this yesterday with a client, is like an accountability buddy. So depending on your sort of relational situation, for the most part, people are accountable to themselves and or to their partners and or to their families and or to their communities. But when you're wholly accountable to yourself and those environments don't put any pressure on you to change, you need a huge amount of self-discipline to change those behaviors. So if you are trying to change a habit or build a new habit, as we've spoken about, then sometimes I think an accountability buddy, someone that you're riding with, for example, you got up at 4:30, you're accountable to someone because you've made a commitment to be there. So I think things like the AA also create levels of accountability because it provides communities that are saying, hey, don't do this.
Yeah.
And I think if you're trying to build a new habit, it would be useful to do it with somebody. It doesn't necessarily have to be in the same country or kitchen if you're making your coffee and planking, but somebody that will hold you accountable for the change.
Yeah.
And it will be on your back if you don't do it.
Yeah, for sure. It's definitely, that's definitely worked for me. So Nicola, just before I let you go, the last question I want to ask you is, what's the habit that requires the least effort but makes the greatest difference?
Yeah. Is that a trick question?
I mean, I've got an answer. I've got one
really?
the first one that popped in my head, and that would be to make your bed in the morning.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Requires
That's
the least
a great
effort,
one.
and it starts your day. You've accomplished something already as soon as you jump out of bed.
Yeah.
Put you on the right path. And there's actually a book about this. It's called Make Your Bed. I've read it. I forgot a lot of the content in there, but that was the first one that popped in my mind when I asked myself that question. But I mean, off the top of your head right now, what do you think makes the greatest difference?
Yeah, I love that. I love that one. And although I didn't read the book, I think I watched a short video on YouTube about the same thing, First Make Your Bed. And it was an army chap talking about it.
That's correct.
And what I love about that, I have that discipline. I've always had that discipline. It's hard for me to go downstairs and make a cup of coffee, or even in my hotel rooms, like I'm in a hotel room now, I still make the bed. I mean, I don't think I have to, but I still straighten everything up. It is that sense of order. There's that little sense of order to start your day.
Yeah.
But how about asking you a question?
Okay.
What new habit could you introduce
in my life
on a day-to-day basis? Yeah.
I mean, I would like to think that I'm in quite a good routine at the moment.
Okay.
However, if I could introduce a new habit into my life, would be to start writing, journaling my
Brilliant.
learnings. That would be the first one that pops to my mind. I'm trying to learn Spanish as well at the moment, and although I'm
Wow.
learning new words, I mean, I've read this in many books, and I know this because I practiced it, to write down what you learn straight after, and then review. And I'm a teacher, I know that this is what my kids need to do to study as well. So yeah, that would definitely be the habit for me. Well, Nicola, thank you very much for this brief but very, very, very interesting and insightful conversation. I hope you have a great weekend, and we will catch you again next week. Okay, bye.
Bye. Thanks, Nick.
See you. For more news and content about ThinkerNick, go to www.thinkernick.com or visit our Facebook or Instagram pages @ThinkerNick.